And good morning, and thank you for joining us. I am Hester Wheeler, Assistant Secretary of State. This morning, you'll hear from Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, State Representative Matt Colazar, who happens to be our House Elections Committee Minority Vice Chair, along with our Detroit City Clerk, Janice Winfrey. Reverend Wendell Anthony, President of the NAACP Detroit branch, wanted to be with us, but unfortunately was called off to an emergency. All of us have come together today to denounce the voter suppression bills that have recently been introduced in Lansing by legislators. All of us have shared comment. All of us will share comments, and we will take a few questions from the media as time permits. So thank you again for joining us. And I will now turn the podium over to Michigan's 43rd Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson.
Thank you, Hester. And thank you all for tuning in today. We're here today to condemn the efforts of some of our state legislators to take away the voting rights of Michigan citizens. It is un-American and an affront to every voter in this state. The 39 bills they have introduced do not reflect the values, wants, or needs of our citizens, our state, or our country. The freedom to vote is foundational to our democracy. It enables our freedoms, our personal independence, and our liberty. There's no act more patriotic than protecting the right to vote. Since the foundation of our nation, countless military service members have lost their lives protecting this right. They've put themselves in harm's way to ensure our democracy would endure. And yet here we are, witnessing state legislators acting as if their anti-American effort to take away citizens' freedom to vote is somehow the right thing to do, following an election cycle that saw unprecedented levels of voter engagement and participation. And any disagreement over the policies is a mere political squabble over details. But that is just another attempt to deceive the public about their true intentions. And it doesn't have to be this way, because following the 2020 election, I proposed a plan of policies that would build on our successes and ensure we replicated what worked to bring about the most successful, secure, and accurate election our state has seen in recent history. But instead of doing what is best for our state and our voters, instead of following the facts and the truth and the data, Michigan legislators are choosing to be a part of a national, coordinated, partisan effort to restrict your freedom to vote. They choose to legislate in furtherance of false claims and misinformation about the 2020 election, doubling down on the big lie that has been disproven again and again. So here's what voters do want in Michigan. They want to vote absentee without unnecessary burdens. They want to know that when they return their ballot before 8 p.m. on election day, it will be counted. They want the freedom to choose how to vote and know whatever option they select, in person or absentee, is safe and secure. And they want the policies that made our election in 2020 a success, not policies that would undo the very freedoms to vote that they have embraced in record numbers in every election, since they voted overwhelmingly to amend our state constitution in 2018 to expand democracy in our state. Yet the bills proposed before our legislature don't further any of those goals. In fact, they go against them. Some are even more restrictive than those recently enacted in Georgia. There, voters are able to receive an absentee ballot if they include a driver's license number on their mailed-in application. Here, voters would have to make and mail a paper photocopy of their driver's license, limiting the right to vote by mail to only those who can pay to access a copy machine, and requiring voters to risk identity theft in order to exercise their state constitutional right to vote absentee. Another bill would prohibit any clerk from prepaying the postage on ballot return envelopes, while yet another would empower partisan officials on the local level to effectively ban drop boxes in any county and would prohibit voters from returning their ballots in drop boxes on election day. The list goes on. And even the candy sugar coating on this poisonous package, the bills that seemingly attempt to expand access, are so poorly written and designed in a way that don't even further their stated goals. What's more, not only are the bills anti-American and the opposite of what our voters want, but they're written in a way that's also the way by which Republican leaders are seeking to enact them. They publicly admitted that their goal was to have these bills vetoed by the governor, who, unlike them, was actually elected by a majority of all voters. so that they can solicit signatures from a small selection of their supporters, less than 7% of all Michigan voters, to override any gubernatorial veto and use their gerrymandered power to undo the will of millions of Michigan citizens. Well, make no mistake, this is an attack on our democracy and the American values that make our country strong. They are deceiving the public by claiming their bills improve election integrity when they simply make it harder for all citizens to vote. So don't believe them. These proposals are based on the lies that sought to undermine the will of the voters in our democracy last year, and they should be seen for what they are, an extension of those same lies, seeking to continue to undermine the will of Michigan citizens. For this reason, we're here today to call on every leader in the state to take a stand against them. Be a true American and protect our freedom to vote. On that note, I will now turn things over to another leader who's taking a stand, Detroit City Clerk Janice Winfrey.
Good morning, and thank you, Jocelyn, for allowing me the opportunity to be here today. You know, we all know that these bills are an attack on election administrators and our collective democracy. They include countless ill-informed and nefarious measures that will negatively impact our elections and our voters. For example, by banning the prepaid return postage on absentee ballot envelopes, this legislation discriminates against low-income citizens and prohibits a practice that I implemented some 15 years ago, which has continued without an issue. It is very clear that the legislators who drafted these bills clearly want to restrict the voting rights of the people of Detroit and other like communities. And we're not going to stand for it. We fought too hard. We've worked too hard to ensure access to the ballot, and we will continue that work. It won't bode well for anyone who wants to go against the citizens and democracies and to not allow access to the voting ballot. Thank you so much. And with that, I turn it over to State Representative Matt Kolazar.
Thank you, Clerk. Very much appreciated. As Democratic Vice Chair of the House Elections and Ethics Committee, I stand against this unprecedented attack on voters and our democracy. Our freedom to vote is a fundamental right, and we should be making it as easy and convenient as possible, and certainly should not be creating barriers to it. This Republican package of bills in the Senate shows they are willing to overturn the will of the voters who have made their stance abundantly clear, and they are doing so with the disproportionate power they hold due to the districts they gerrymandered. All Michigan citizens should be alarmed by this attack on their voting rights and in the partisan manner in which it is taking place. As a legislator who has continuously sought the opportunity to work across the aisle in a bipartisan manner, the tactics that I am seeing are now tremendously disappointing. The truth is, Michigan's election was very secure, and my colleagues in the House have worked on numerous pieces of legislation to build on its success and the will of Michigan's voters. I remain hopeful that ultimately all legislators will see the value in advancing legislation based on facts and truth, and this package that attacks voting rights will be abandoned entirely. And with that, we will be happy to take questions.
First question from Rachel Louise. If all members of the media would please raise your electronic hand to ask a question. You will need to unmute yourself to ask that question, and then you will be remuted when your question is finished. Thank you. Rachel Louise.
Hey, Secretary, thank you so much for taking the time to answer my question. I had a few questions for you, but first of all, can you give some specific examples of how this would impact minority Michiganders? I know you've talked about how it would restrict access to the ballot booth for some people, but can you give me some really specific examples from these bills? And secondly, some of these bills would expand voting access, like having an additional day to vote. Do you support those, or do you just blanket not support any of these bills right now?
I'll take that second question first, and then I'm actually going to turn it over to the city clerk for the city of Detroit to talk specifically about how many of these provisions, as she did in her remarks, would negatively impact our historically disenfranchised communities and communities of color. Of course, underscoring, well, I'll let her discuss that. So there, about the bills in the package you mentioned, there is, as I mentioned during my remarks, some candy sugar coating on what is a poisonous package of legislation that we believe is intended to make some things look good when in reality, when you dig a little deeper, they don't have their intended effect. So let's take first, as you mentioned, the bill establishing early in-person voting. It does so only 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. on the second Saturday before Election Day, rather when most needed, which is closer to Election Day and on multiple weekends and weekend days, and weekdays across daytime evening hours that enable all voters to take advantage of this potential opportunity to vote this way. So again, you see an example of even a banner headline of allowing early voting. When you look into the details, it doesn't actually allow early voting for all of our citizens, only those who are going to make it there in a particular window at a particular time. And while I hope that we can go in the direction of enabling real early voting in Michigan, this bill doesn't do that. And it enables perhaps a legislature to say we're doing that when in reality, in practice, it won't play out in a way that enables that early voting option for every citizen. There's another bill that requires the BOE to post names of clerks that are not current on required training. That's great in theory. We believe, and we've been working with the BOE to ensure that clerks have access to the educational resources they need to make democracy work for every citizen. But the bill requires this be done at times just when newly elected clerks are taking office. And so it's going to inherently create misinformation about clerks who will ultimately be ready to do their jobs, but certainly haven't gone through that training immediately upon taking office. The bill to pre-register 16-year-olds only allows that a person at a Secretary of State branch be able to do that, denying our young people access to all of the options of voter registration that are available to others, and also creating unnecessary confusion, particularly among young people, about the proper way to ensure they're registered at that age. The bill extending the county canvass from 14 to 21 days, again, is something that I have supported and on broad strokes, but the specific language of this bill fails to enable state canvassers to continue to meet 6 days after county canvasses are completed, thereby opening up a window for more misinformation at the state level to continue. And finally, the bill only allows military overseas voters, not their spouses. There's a bill that only allows military overseas voters, not their spouses, not their dependents, to return ballots securely and electronically and throw away the Common Access Card, which service members themselves say is consistently unreliable to the extent that the Department of Defense doesn't allow the CAC card to be used to return ballots. So in fact, last year on that particular piece of legislation, just like so many others, we've already given the legislature the specifics of what actually proposals like that would look like. In this case, both the House and Senate passed a better version of that particular bill that enables overseas voters to return their ballots securely and electronically. That bill was passed last session with large bipartisan majorities, and then Senate Majority Leader Shirkey simply didn't hand the bill formally to the governor for signature. So these are the type of political games that we're also here today to shine a light on. In my view, and in the clerk's view, and in legislators like Representative Kolazar's view, we just want to do the job of protecting every single citizen's right to vote, regardless of where they live, regardless of how they choose to vote, and regardless of who they vote for. These bills make it harder to do that, regardless of what side of the aisle you are on. And that's why we all need to come together right now and speak the truth, follow the facts and the data, and make sure everyone in Michigan knows exactly what's going on here so that we can protect democracy from efforts to undermine it, just as we've done so over the past year in protecting everyone's access to the vote. So with that, I'll turn it over also to Clerk Winfrey to talk about some of the ways in which the bills in this package particularly undermine the voices of citizens of color in our state.
Thank you. So these bills make voting harder for our citizens. We want to continue to use satellite voting. These bills speak against that. Satellite voting allow for us to put vote centers in the neighborhoods where people are comfortable going to, where people can easily get to. You know, elections is a community endeavor. It's not one person's job to administer maybe one person's job to administer, but certainly it's all of our jobs to be a part of the process. And so when we use buildings that people are familiar with, like their local Y or their community college that's near them, and those kinds of buildings that they're familiar with, that they can go and cast their absentee ballot in person, ensuring that it goes inside, not a tabulator, but a transfer box to be counted later. These things are important to our people. In addition, the drop boxes. Drop boxes are necessary when the Postal Service is experiencing problems. People want to ensure that their ballot will be going to the right place, the place it should be, the Department of Elections in this case. We want to make sure that the election administrators will get their ballot in a timely fashion. All of these things are important. And even still, there's still a sect of voters that want to go to the precincts on election day. And that's okay. And that's why we open all of our precincts. But to deny us the ability to go out and service someone who might not be able to get in the door because of a handicap or some kind of issue that they may not be able to stand in long line. So to prevent curbside voting is a slap in the face to those Americans that may be disabled or somehow handicapped. These are the kinds of initiatives that we would like to remain in place. To get rid of these things is to get rid of democracy. You know, we took an oath as elected officials. We took an oath to hold up the Constitution, you know, to ensure that what we're doing to the best of our ability and as under the Constitution. And everyone has a right to vote. Everyone has a right to vote easily. And these bills are doing just the opposite. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Clerk. And if I could, I want to underscore one point on the drop boxes, on the secure drop boxes that were in place throughout the state in the 2020 election. What we saw here in Detroit and in many other places, I'll note that one of the bills prohibits the counting of valid votes that are dropped in drop boxes on election day. The majority of ballots returned through drop boxes in 2020 were dropped off on election day, particularly in the city of Detroit, where there were a few dozen secure drop boxes, everyone secured all around the city, utilized heavily by citizens choosing to exercise their right to vote absentee. These bills, so this particular bill, would disenfranchise the citizens. Again, it was many of the citizens who dropped off their absentee ballots that they have a right to do at a drop box on election day before 8 p.m. So that's a very clear example of not following the data, which shows that citizens embrace drop boxes, shows that citizens appreciate the use of drop boxes, particularly on election day, and shows that drop boxes are administered securely, particularly because the vast majority of these are right outside the satellite clerk's offices that were also set up throughout the state or throughout the city. So there's no data to suggest that banning the use of drop boxes at any point, particularly on the day when they're most utilized, is going to do anything other than disenfranchise citizens in the city of Detroit and all across the state who rely on those drop boxes to return those ballots safely and securely by 8 p.m. on election day.
Jonathan Osting with Bridge Magazine, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Jonathan.
Yeah, hi, Secretary Benson. Thanks for taking my question. Another bill in this proposal would bar election officials from using outside funding from private groups to fund election administration. Can you speak to grants that the state and local governments received last year from groups like the Center for Tech and Civic Life? How are those used, and were they important last year?
Yes, I'm happy to. I think the bottom line is, if you look at the broad context of the year, that where we saw the need to manage 4 high turnout elections in the midst of a pandemic, that takes resources. And I asked throughout 2019, the state legislature to provide those resources to the state and to, in particular, our local communities. We then asked the federal government, after the state denied those requests and didn't provide significant funding to support our elections. We then asked the federal government to do it, myself and representatives on both sides of the aisle from every state in this country. Federal government didn't act either. They gave us CARES Act funding, which was put to good use, in particular to provide PPE and to ensure that citizens had access to materials to request absentee ballots on time and efficiently. But it wasn't enough. And so just like many states throughout the country, Michigan needed more resources to ensure, in particular, that in the midst of a time of great uncertainty, with so many things changing as a result of the pandemic, that they had the clarity and the certainty of how to exercise their fundamental right to vote. The voter education that came through that private funding that went to our local communities, that also, by the way, enabled them to purchase materials to efficiently tabulate securely ballots that were voted absentee, and also educate citizens about how to return those ballots, where to get them from satellite clerks' offices, how to even establish satellite clerks' offices. That funding, again, accepted at the local level, was critical to use to make democracy work at a time when our state and federal governments failed to step up to the plate. So if the state government doesn't like that, then they should fully fund our elections. We'll welcome that. Thanks.
Grant Hermes with WDIV. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Secretary. Thanks for taking my question. You said that these bills are part of a national coordinated effort. So do we have actual evidence of coordination across state lines, or do we know where these bills came from, the impetus for these things?
I think you should ask the legislators who proposed them specifically where they came from, but let's look at the evidence. Georgia, Arizona, Texas, Iowa, Wyoming, soon Ohio. We're seeing the exact same bills, exact same language in some cases, sometimes worse, sometimes more in line with the code of the state. But in nearly 47 states in this country, over 250 bills have been introduced just since the beginning of this year that carry so many of the similarities we see in the bills in Michigan. I'll also point out the fact that there is in the Republican Legislative Senate or committee, there is an organization that has created a commission that is co-chaired by the chair of our state Senate committee, State Senator Ruth Johnson, that is in line with and openly saying they are going state to state to promote policies like this. So I'll point to those two data points and, again, invite the state legislators and senators who proposed these pieces of legislation to explain exactly why and how it is that the timing and the wording is so similar to the very exact same voter suppression attempts we're seeing in other states around the country.
John Rurick with MERS. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Secretary. I was wondering if you've had a chance to sit down face-to-face with legislative leaders to negotiate this package. Would you do so on a final package if it moves? And also, there's talk about moving the primary in 2022. Is that realistic given the uncertainty we have about when maps would be done?
On your first question, yes, I welcome the opportunity to talk with our state legislators, as I have and have been doing since the beginning of the year, when we introduced a series of legislative proposals that actually do follow the data and the interests and the needs of the voters in improving our election laws. So yes, those conversations are ongoing. I hope that they can be collaborative. I have not yet experienced those conversations to actually lead to any productive collaboration or changes to the legislation, but hope springs eternal. I certainly am willing to sit down and talk with legislators in ways that can improve the fabric of election policies we have in our state. And indeed, I've done that since taking office almost over 2 years ago. With regards to your second question, remind me again.
You're on, please unmute.
Talk of moving. There was talk.
Oh yes,
about
the primary. I
primary.
apologize. Yeah, I got focused on it. So yes, there are a lot of moving pieces when it comes to next year's elections, not the least of which is the deliverance of census data to the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. My hope, though, there is a proposal that I support to consolidate our May and August elections that, and I've been very clear in my conversations with the legislatures about this, that should not go into effect until 2024 because of all the other pieces that have to go into play in 2022. In other words, there's no, in my view, reason or need to change the date of the August 2022 primary. And certainly there's no benefit at this point to moving it up because to a June date, for example, or a sooner date, because of all of the other moving pieces with redistricting and the delivering of census data. But I have been a part of those conversations to see those changes potentially apply in future elections. And I'll say as part of those conversations, cities like the city of Detroit have also made clear the challenges in consolidating those dates in years where you also have odd number years elections as well. So there's a lot more conversations that need to happen on that front in particular, and that's why it's also important, I think, that we look to applying any of those changes not before 2024.
Eli Newman, WDET, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, and thank you for your availability today. My first question is really, I mean, it seems like your message today is really directed at Republican state lawmakers, but I'm wondering if you have a general call to action for Michigan residents in terms of what they can do on this issue. And secondly, and this is more specifically for City Clerk Winfrey, is with city elections coming up in Detroit this year, I'm wondering if things will likely proceed as they did during the November election, if there's going to be utilization of the TCF Center, those similar measures, and more specifically, I'm also wondering if you will be running for another term as city clerk.
I'll take the first one. With regards to a call to action, I'm grateful in particular for the business leaders, the leaders from our sports community, and the leaders in other industries throughout the state who have stood up to voice their opposition to these proposals and the damaging effect they would do, not just to our ability to vote, but to the reputation of the state. At a time when we have an opportunity to show the country that we can develop bipartisan solutions, that the legislature and the governor and our office would all support, and indeed that I've proposed that can be bipartisan ways of moving forward in improving and advancing the vote and improving our democracy. My hope is that we can move further in that direction. And my call to action for citizens who have not yet spoken out is to do so, to make sure that every citizen who voted in support of these policies in 2018, in support of their right to vote absentee, to embrace the reality that the fight for democracy is never truly finished, and we must again continue to push forward in this work and ensure that your lawmakers know your views on what you want our democracy to look like. So just as millions of citizens embrace these policies, embrace the right to vote absentee, embrace the use of drop boxes and many other things in 2020, I hope those citizens now will contact their state legislators and know exactly what they want to see in their democracy and celebrate the successes we saw in 2020. And I also want to underscore before turning it over to the city clerk that in my view, we fought significant effort in 2020 to protect every citizen's right to vote, regardless of where they lived or how they voted, and to make sure they could, if they looked at the facts and the evidence and the data and block out the misinformation and the noise, they could have the assurance, as they should, that the election was fair, secure, and an accurate reflection of the will of the people. So I encourage all citizens, regardless of your partisan affiliation, to think critically about what elected officials are telling you, to look at the truth, to look at the data, to go to michigan.gov/SOS fact check if you have specific questions about the election, and then to not allow legislation to be proposed or to come into law, and certainly not with your signatures sign anything that would support the overturning of the will of the voters and the overturning of policies that worked so well to ensure the will of the voters was heard. So with that, I'll turn it over to the city clerk.
So yes, the city of Detroit will continue to administer our elections the same way that we did in 2020. We will be, TCF has always been the place where we count our absentee ballots. And so, yes, we will be utilizing TCF. Yes, we will continue to use our satellites and our drop boxes, and we will mail to our constituents. I must remind you that we're still living in a pandemic. We still have to wear these masks. We still have to social distance, and we must keep not only our staff safe, but our voters safe as well. And yes, I do plan on running for city clerk again.
Dave Eggert with Associated Press, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Secretary. Thanks for taking my question.
Sure.
Wanted to ask, see if you could specifically address the bill that would require voters to attach a copy of their ID when they submit an absentee ballot application. Can you talk about that and also the practicality of it, both for voters and on clerk's end of it?
Yeah, I think this bill you mentioned that requires citizens who want to request to vote absentee by mail to attach a photocopy of their driver's license to their request serves no other purpose than to make it harder for them to vote absentee. That's it. There's no security provision. There's no evidence or data or even precedent to suggest that that somehow would prevent voter fraud. Of course, already citizens must sign the application that they mail in. That signature is then matched to the signature on record and used to identify the voter. And notably, if we're talking about data, it's much more difficult for someone who's, let's say, trying to impersonate a voter or commit voter fraud. It's much more difficult to forge a signature than it is to create a fake ID, photocopy it, and send it in. So there's no security provision at all in this provision. The only impact it will have is not to make our elections more secure, not to make the absentee ballot process more secure, but to make voting by absentee harder, particularly for those populations who typically request to vote absentee in this way. For our elderly citizens who now will have to find access to a copy machine in order to vote absentee, even though they may have been voting absentee and requesting to vote absentee in a different way for years. For our young voters, for college students going to school outside of state, it will make it harder for them to vote and for their voices to be heard. That's it. That's the impact. The other thing I'll emphasize, and the Attorney General will be talking about this, I'm sure, as well, is the increased opportunity for identity theft that is opened up when you have this provision in place. The ability and the requirement that someone send a copy of their photo or a photocopy of their photo identification with an application opens them up to the potential for identity theft in a way that is, again, completely unnecessary to further any other interest of the state. So there's no reason for this bill. The only impact it has is to affect the security of our citizens' personal data and their right to vote. And that's why this is one of the most pernicious aspects of this package, of which, again, there are many.
We have just a couple more questions. I think Rachel Louise, you had a follow-up question. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. We'll try to fit in a couple more, but we'll see how time goes here, folks. Thank you.
Actually, my follow-up question was answered, but I did have another question. Could you speak to how these bills are different than those that are in Georgia? I know you've said that they're more restrictive. In what way?
Yep, as an example, the bill I just talked about isn't even part of the Georgia package. In Georgia, a citizen can write their driver's license number on the application and request it that way. That's a policy that's in place, and similarly in other states as well. There are still some details, I think, that can cause confusion in the Georgia legislation, which I'll allow those folks closer to Georgia to comment on. But the bottom line is, even in Georgia, they're not requesting citizens submit a photocopy of their ID in order to request an absentee ballot. That's the bottom line. Now, every state is different. Every state has there's best practices and best policies, but every state has different histories, and indeed, that's one of the things that enables democracy to work so well. But here's a case where you have a state that's been much aligned in the news, Georgia, for its restrictive voting package, and an example where here in Michigan, the bills, which again, there's a path that legislators have talked about to make them become law, overriding the governor's veto, that would be more restrictive than Georgia. And that's why what you're going to see over the next months, for as long as this package of bills is on the table, is certainly an effort to collaborate, to make better policy. but also an effort to speak the truth to citizens who may be put in the crossfire if they're asked to sign petitions that would override a governor's veto of these policies, to make sure everyone knows the real details and the pernicious details behind these policies so that we can protect citizens, protect their right to vote, and we will work to engage every citizen in the state in being a part of that protective effort.
We'll take one last question. Jonathan Osting, I believe you had a follow-up. If you'd unmute yourself.
Yeah, actually, it's a follow-up to Dave Eggert's question about needing a photocopy of an ID for absentee ballot applications. A voter who is already registered, would they have had to show identification at some point prior in that process? Would this be redundant essentially?
Yes, it would be redundant, in part because there are multiple ways to identify a voter, not just when they register, but also when they request their application. We already have security protocols in place to confirm the identity of a voter requesting to vote absentee through the signature protections. Those signature protocols have worked. They have ensured, not just in Michigan, but in other states, a secure way of identifying a voter's identity. And there are so point one, but point two, with regards to the registration process, there are multiple ways in which someone can become registered to vote in our state. Every one of them requires some form of identification, whether it's a voter's signature or whether it's additional documentation. For example, when citizens are given the option of automatically being registered when they do business with the Secretary of State's office, that also comes with documentation that is part of a transaction that is perhaps getting an ID at the time, and then in which someone becomes registered to vote through that way. So there's way, and of course, in any application to register to vote, you must sign as well, and that signature also affirms the identity of the voter in subsequent security checks. So in other words, there are already secure protocols in place to affirm the identity of the registered voter in the absentee voting process. They work well. That's why you didn't see widespread fraud in this past 2020 election. And they also work to ensure that if there are any nefarious attempts at fraud, that they're caught and prosecuted. And you also see examples of that as well in the rare circumstances when it occurs.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.